Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir. I'm Catherine Spencer-Ross, and I'm president of Heritage Ottawa and chair of our lecture series committee. Welcome to our first lecture of 2023. I'm very pleased that our speakers tonight will be talking about one of the most extraordinary communities in Ottawa that began life as a government program that has since become a heritage icon, or more accurately, a veterans housing character area. Some of you may remember an article on the area in our newsletter in late 2021, written by Greg MacPherson, one of our speakers this evening. Our Q&A session at the end of this evening's lecture will be hosted by Leslie Maitland, a former president of Heritage Ottawa, a strong voice on our advocacy committee, and a doyen of heritage in Ottawa. Leslie will come on after the presentation and will moderate the questions and then close our event. Our lecture series is made possible through the generosity of our sponsor, Andrix Holdings, Inc., and Sandy Smallwood. Andrix has been a faithful sponsor of these free lectures, as well as of our walks and sub-publications. We're also grateful for an operations grant from the City of Ottawa and a heritage grant from the province of Ontario. I'd like to offer my heartfelt thanks to those of you who have made donations to Heritage Ottawa and encourage this very concrete form of support. We have another couple of months left in our fundraising for 2022-2023. If you're not yet a member, I invite you to join Heritage Ottawa and to make a financial contribution to the organization. Your ongoing support through membership and donations is critical. It means we will be able to continue to offer programs like this free lecture series. Additionally, the provincial government's new Bill 23 and imposed amendments to Ottawa's new official plan will undermine heritage conservation in our city. Heritage Ottawa's work to protect heritage buildings and historic places is more important than ever. Please visit our website for information. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speakers for tonight, Avery Marshall and Greg MacPherson. Avery Marshall is a public sector heritage practitioner with over a decade of experience conducting historical research and interpreting collections. Her focus areas include Ottawa's built heritage, local commemoration, and public art. She's the Heritage Register Coordinator for the City of Ottawa and a member of the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. Greg MacPherson is a heritage planner with the City of Ottawa. His experience includes leading heritage permit approvals for development applications, researching and writing statements of cultural heritage value for property designations, and heritage-related policy work. He holds a bachelor's degree in urban planning from the University of Waterloo and is currently completing a Master's of Arts in Canadian Studies with a focus on heritage conservation at Carleton University. Avery and Greg will share with us historical background of Carlington and its heritage future. And with that, I'll turn the mic over to Avery to begin tonight's presentation.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I want to thank Catherine, first of all, and the team at Heritage Ottawa for inviting Greg and I to speak about the veterans housing here in our city. This has been a meaningful area of study for both of us. In 2020, as we were preparing to begin work on veterans housing, Ottawa City Council declared a housing and homelessness emergency here. Although the challenges of wartime housing were very different than what we're experiencing today, it is powerful to recognize what happened in Carlington and in other neighborhoods in Ottawa to combat a housing crisis many decades ago. For tonight, we have divided our talk into 3 segments. I'm going to begin with part 1, history and context. Greg will guide us through part 2, planning tools and the veterans housing character area. And part 3 will be a discussion moderated by Leslie, and we should have some time for questions. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to recognize some of the contributors who made our presentation tonight possible. Many residents, current and past, the Veterans Neighborhood Kids Facebook group, Lee Wainwright, Cheryl Walsh, and many others. Thank you for sharing your perspectives and your different experiences with us. We received support from the Carlington Community Association, as well as Councillor Brockington and the River Ward team. Thank you. I've had several institutions, including City of Ottawa Archives, The Department of National Defence and Veterans Affairs Canada helped tremendously with our research, as did Emma Dodens, Christopher Teifer, and heritage planning staff at the city who worked closely on this project with us. Thank you. So for part one, history and context. To set the stage for tonight, let's travel back to the 1930s. So we're in Ottawa, it's the Great Depression. Residential construction has declined. Not only did difficult economic conditions result in fewer new homes being built, but this also meant fewer owners could make repairs to their houses, and our city's building stock began to deteriorate. In 1939, fighting began in Europe. Canada officially entered the Second World War. Here on the home front, war industries geared up, and we saw supply shortages and rationing. A lack of skilled labor occurred as tradespeople were pulled into war industry, or they enlisted on a new level of overcrowding as workers flocked to urban centers. Several factors contributed to a nationwide housing shortage by 1939 when the war began, and it continued for several years. It was during this housing crisis that a new corporation, Wartime Housing Limited, was established by the federal government. In 1941, under advisement of the War Measures Act and the Department of Munitions and Supply Act, the Privy Council ordered the creation of Wartime Housing Limited. This was a wartime housing company. The corporation was to provide temporary rental housing for workers during the Second World War. Wartime Housing Limited operated under a board of directors, much like a private company. Sites for new housing projects were assessed, and priority was given to communities with a great need for homes, typically those near munitions production. Wartime Housing Limited was involved in every phase of a housing project, from subdivision planning to architecture to construction contracts, sourcing material, finance, collecting rent, and managing tenants. These were temporary structures. The idea was that when the manufacturing work came to an end, the factories closed, there'd be no need for the workers, and the houses would be dismantled. The construction methods that were used were easily reversible to allow the housings to be taken down quickly. Temporary housing for workers began to pop up across Canada near war industries. With dozens of crews working all at once, a single house could be constructed in 36 hours. Wartime Housing Limited built dormitories and shared staff accommodations, as well as detached homes. Housing projects soon appeared close to Ottawa, including this site across the river in Hull. In 1942, the Ottawa Journal reported that Wartime Housing Limited's 150 house project in Hull's Wrightville was almost complete. The new homes were earmarked for employees of war industry and their subcontractors. On this side of the river, Ottawa was similarly experiencing overcrowding and asked for consideration. Wartime Housing Limited found that Ottawa was not a center of overcrowding due to industrial activity from munitions productions, and therefore would not consider any applications for homes. Ottawa was ineligible at the time to apply. As the war went on and the housing shortage continued, the federal government directed Wartime Housing Limited to expand. So their operations changed, and by 1944, they included construction of housing for returning servicemen and their families. This was a major shift in operations. House designs began to acquire a more permanent character, including better frame construction, more integrated foundations that could not be so easily dismantled. And housing sites, they are no longer tied to factories. In 1945, Wartime Housing Limited, in collaboration with Ottawa and Nepean City Councils, approved construction of 200 rental houses for returning veterans here in Ottawa. The agreement stipulated that the houses would be available to lease to soldiers or airmen and sailors of the Armed Forces of Canada and or their dependents who reside in Ottawa. So the Crown purchased land in Nepean. So the land is shown here in purple. Nepean agreed to transfer these lands to Ottawa in exchange for Ottawa servicing the neighborhood with utilities and paving the roads, among other stipulations. So just to give you a sense of where we are, you can see Dow's Lake at the right here. Carling Avenue runs from Dow's Lake across to Merivale, and then Merivale runs south here. The experimental farm wraps around the area. So today, this larger neighborhood is known as Carlington. This used to be the edge of the city right where Ottawa and Nepean met. Carlington includes several subdivisions, and part of Carlington includes the wartime housing limited subdivisions that we're discussing tonight. So the site that was purchased, the site was selected and purchased. This was the former J.R. Booth Nepean Lumberyard. It used to be known, pardon me, as the City View Yards, which was active into the 1940s when the wartime demand for lumber cleared out their supply. Until the site was cleared for housing, lumber piles and rail cars were part of the landscape here. It was not uncommon later for workers and families to find rail ties buried in their backyards. So the first Ottawa housing project was planned out and construction began. So this was a subdivision of 200 rental houses. The subdivision plan is showing on the left. Wartime Housing Limited efficiently laid out the streets for the 200 dwellings within each subdivision. The first subdivision included houses on Carling, Merivale, Viscount, Herald, and Crerar. The new street names had a military theme. The placement of each house on its lot and the pattern of each street within the plan of subdivision created a distinct and recognizable spatial arrangement. It included cul-de-sacs, ellipses, median islands, curved streets, and irregular lots. You can see on the subdivision plan, there are some tight curves in there, particularly around Herald Place Park, and the houses are organized in an unconventional fashion. This is quite a departure from much of subdivision planning that happened in Ottawa before the war. Typically, we saw a grid pattern and rectangular lots. The Second World War ended in September 1945. More and more veterans returned home. Overcrowding and lack of accommodations were compounded by this influx of returning vets. Some returned with spouses and families in tow. Temporary accommodations were offered at several sites, including the Varsity Oval Barracks that's near the University of Ottawa's athletic field, also at the Rockcliffe Air Base and other sites in Ottawa. These images show the Veterans Housing Projects, the first project under construction near Carling and Merivale. The simplicity of the design allowed for prefabrication of interchangeable sections, such as windows and doors and some of the framing, and a highly efficient mass production kept costs low. December 1945, so just a few months after the war ended, the first homes were completed. 5-year war veteran T.K. Bishop, he and his family were the very first to move in. Construction of all 200 homes was completed in early 1946. Hundreds more families moved to the area. This first project was known as Veterans Housing Project Number 1, and it covered approximately 30 acres. The lands were annexed from Nepean to Ottawa. Wartime Housing Limited offered to purchase the land immediately south of the first subdivision. Veterans Housing Project Number 2 began right away in 1946 and included another 200 rental houses and a school, W. Gowling Public School. Project Number 2 covered about 71, includes homes on Admiral, Anna, Tunis, Crown, Fisher, Merivale, Marshall, and on General Ave. These are the homes after they were completed. Nepean Council stipulated that war veterans residing in Nepean must be eligible to apply for tenancy, and that their applications would be given the same considerations as veteran applicants from Ottawa. This was a shift from the first subdivision. The first Veterans Housing Project was only eligible for veterans who lived in Ottawa and their families. This second project opened eligibility to those in Nepean as well, so very specific to City of Ottawa and City of Nepean residents. It is important to note that due to the lack of information we have on eligibility, it's not clear who may have been excluded from applying to veterans housing, whether explicitly or implicitly. After the Second World War, female veterans and racialized veterans particularly First Nations veterans, faced unequal access to government benefits and programs, including housing. Widows, we know they were eligible through their veteran husbands, but we have no information of eligibility for female veterans, such as ambulance drivers or combat nurses, who may have applied on the merit of their own veteran status. So in total, 400 houses were built. So these were 1 and 1/2 story houses that were constructed for veterans by Wartime Housing Limited in what is now Ottawa. This image in the background, you can see the 1-story model, which is the lower roof, and then right in the center, you can see 1 and 1/2 story. So that house would have 2 levels, 2 floors in it. The homes had multi-pane windows. They were clad in either wood or asbestos. The houses go by several different names. We've heard them called strawberry box houses and victory cottages, victory homes, veterans houses or vets houses. The area is also known by several names, including the vets, and we've heard Happy Valley as well. Although the homes were built by Wartime Housing Limited and construction began during wartime, the housing projects in Ottawa are also an example of post-war housing. They were purpose-built from 1945 to 1947 for returning vets who rented them. In 1947, Wartime Housing Limited was dissolved. Its assets were transferred to what is now the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC. Around 1951, CMHC began to sell off the veterans' houses, making them available for tenants to purchase. The rent that they had paid previously could go towards the down payment. Units sold for about $6,000 each. These owners were now able to modify the houses to suit their needs and the needs of their growing families. Some of these homes have had several owners since the 1940s, while others have stayed in the family. We photographed the area back in September 21, and I'm going to go through a few of the images to offer a glimpse into the vets housing area today. These are some images around Harold Place Park. This is Merivale Road. So we're looking north and you can see a red brick building across the street on Carling Ave. That's one of the hydro buildings. This is a giant tree on Marshall. You can see how a lot of the trees in the images really dwarf the homes. They are quite dramatic how tall the trees are. Here's another one. This is Marshall Avenue. And here's Viscount. So in the foreground here, you can see what we're calling this is a median island. So we describe these often as a grassy median island, a grassy island in the front. Here's another example. This is Purar, and you can see a larger sort of island in the middle there. And all the houses are fanned out facing it. So just before I wrap up, so these homes, they were built directly in response to the housing crisis of the period. The veterans' houses that were built by Wartime Housing Limited, they reflected a coordinated effort from several levels of government. I mentioned federal level, we had the province involved in the annexation, and we had Nepean and Ottawa. There were also several private sector players, and this was a time of considerable need. So these were some of the first subdivisions built in Ottawa after the Second World War, and they represent a defining moment in residential planning here in Ottawa. The ongoing residential use of the subdivisions does continue the tradition of the Second World War veterans and their families who lived in them. Before we move ahead to part 2, I just want to mention some further reading. There's a few titles that I want to share. These are online. Jill Wade's article, Wartime Housing Limited, that's at the top of the list. I also want to mention a National Film Board film by Graham McInnes that he directed. It's available from nfb.ca, and I've included some screenshots from his video in this presentation. It's not on this list, but I'll also mention the Journal of the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. They featured several articles about Wartime Housing Limited in the 1940s, and those journals are available from Dalhousie University on their website. We have at the city, we've compiled an enormous amount of reference material. If you are interested in learning more, or if you have information to share with us, please send us an email. Greg and I would be happy to hear from you. We can be reached at heritage@ottawa.ca. And with that, I'll pass it over to Greg for part 2.
Okay. Thank you so much, Avery, for that detailed overview of the history of the neighborhood. And just want to start with a quick thanks to Heritage Ottawa as well. Really appreciate you for having us both out tonight. So now for part 2, we're going to turn our attention to the Veterans Housing Character Area, which throughout I might refer to as the VHCA, which is a heritage character area and set of guidelines that apply to this neighborhood that was adopted by City Council in May 2022. So to start, I just want to provide a quick overview of what that is and how it works. So in Ottawa, heritage character areas are a tool implemented under the city's official plan. This is different than typical heritage conservation tools or programs in Ontario. So things like designation or heritage conservation districts, which are enabled by the Ontario Heritage Act. The city's official plan has some policies which establishes that the city can enact other tools, including things like design guidelines or interpretive programs, to support heritage conservation. So a character area is an example of one of those other tools. And the Veterans Housing Character Area builds on this character area model that was established in Ottawa by earlier examples like the Sandy Hill Heritage Character Area and the Richmond Village Character Area. Essentially, it acts as guidelines that help residents, property owners, and the development community design alterations and additions and new construction in ways that are compatible with the area's character. Rather than requiring permits for changes to properties, they instead help contextualize decisions within the existing planning process for the specific area. So like many city initiatives, the story of the Veterans Housing Character Area starts as a council direction. In 2019, the city undertook the Heritage Inventory Project, which involved the completion of a citywide heritage inventory and the addition of many properties to the city's heritage register. Through the council approval process and associated report, staff were directed to complete a specific study of the Carlington Veterans Housing neighborhoods and determine appropriate heritage conservation measures. So this was slated to start sometime in 2019 or 2020, but due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this was postponed and delayed until 2021. So the study involved sort of 3 distinct but overlapping phases, roughly arranged around kind of the common model of heritage conservation decision-making. So broadly, we sought to understand the place, and the place being the Veterans Housing neighborhoods, and then determine how best to manage change in the area. So understanding the place involved research and documentation, public consultation, and then an overall heritage assessment. Due to some factors like time constraints and also resource availability, particularly in relation to the pandemic, which limited our access to archives, in-person meetings, et cetera. These phases often happened simultaneously and primarily online. So I'll now briefly take you through each of these phases. So Avery's already detailed much of the area's historical background, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much. But I will touch quickly on our approach and some of the resources we consulted. So generally, our intent was to understand the neighborhood as a whole, not necessarily the stories of individual residents or the wider national story of wartime housing. Our scope ultimately was local and tied directly to the buildings and the land within the neighborhood. We consulted a number of primary and secondary resources, including archival material related to the area's planning and approvals. So access through places like the Library and Archives Canada and City Archives. And then also books related to the history of Ottawa and Nepean, and city directories, and also histories documented by some of the area's amazing local residents groups. So thank you all so much for all the work that you've put together over the years. And what you can see on screen is an excerpt from one of the 1946 City of Ottawa directories, which is a really amazing resource that gives a lot of detail about who were the people who lived in different areas. So on the left, you can see actually Anna Avenue, which is one of the streets in the character area, and a listing of all the residents at the time. Here's a photo of the Carlington Summit. So that's a local newspaper that was also an amazing resource for photos and also just general information about the neighborhood. And then here's a selection of photos from our fieldwork. So Avery mentioned we had undertaken some fieldwork as part of this, where we documented all of the buildings in the study area. We also conducted an online survey and 2 public meetings that were held over Zoom. We connected with residents over email, the phone, and in person when conducting that fieldwork. And if this project was to happen today, a lot more in-person engagement would have been undertaken and planned, but these were ultimately limited largely by the pandemic. So following the conclusion of the research and engagement stages, we needed to summarize everything we learned and determine the elements that really define the heritage character of the area. So generally, these can be broken down into 2 main categories. First, as this slide shows, broadly thematically. So the area is tied to a number of themes. So of course, the Second World War is an important theme in the history of this area, but also the post-war period of rapid urban development, much of which has come to define Ottawa as it exists today. Additionally, the lives of local residents, and also more broadly, the changes to life in Ottawa in the post-war era. Third, the associations of this area to significant national and local institutions. So as Avery had mentioned, Wartime Housing Limited was a very influential branch of the government at the time. And then also the CMHC, which still exists to this day. And then ultimately the City of Ottawa and the former City of Nepean, which this project was one step along the way to getting to the current City of Ottawa that we know. And then finally, as well, the associations of these houses to the wider archetype of wartime housing and also emerging movements in planning and architecture at the time. These images include some more photos from our fieldwork and also an excerpt from the guidelines, which illustrates some of the house's key physical elements in the area. So these represent the sort of second category of attributes that we identified, which is more related to the area's pattern of development and physical characteristics. So most notably, we found that the scale and form of the neighborhood was distinct and important. Very broadly, this means things like the size and shape of the houses, the relationship between lot sizes and building sizes, and the location of buildings on lots all contribute to the character of the area. It also recognizes the distinct street patterns, so things like the large medians that Avery was mentioning. Here, it's also important to recognize the original design intent of these houses, which, as mentioned briefly, were meant to be built efficiently, but still built well, to grow and change with their residents as needed, and to respond flexibly to the needs of their residents through things like alterations and additions over time. So after completing our research, heritage assessment, and consultation, the next stage in this process involved determining how best to manage change. So this involved an assessment of all possible heritage conservation tools enabled under both the Ontario Heritage Act and the Planning Act. We wanted to look at everything and really ensure that we were making the best choice. The context of our decision-making was also a bit different than it is today. The city's new official plan was not yet approved by the province, but was approved by council. And recent legislative changes brought down from the province were not really yet on our horizon. We looked at more traditional approaches, so things like the creation of a heritage conservation district or the addition of a number of properties to the city's heritage register. But also we looked at non-standard tools like formal recognition of a cultural heritage landscape, which is something that's been explored by other municipalities in the province, or also things like the establishment of a community planning permit system. Ultimately, staff recommended that a cultural heritage character area be established along with associated guidelines. So as noted earlier, cultural heritage character area recognizes the area's distinct heritage attributes, while also setting out guidelines to inform the design and decision-making related to alterations and new construction in the area. As a key distinction between something like a heritage conservation district, a cultural heritage character area is implemented under the official plan, and it doesn't require additional approvals for heritage purposes. Instead, it works within the existing planning and approval system to positively influence development decisions. So there were several reasons for this recommendation. First, a character area can recognize the thematic and physical values of the neighborhood through context statements, descriptions of attributes, and the guidelines themselves. We felt that it was important to present that information in whatever tool provides flexibility to respond to development in the area while also recognizing the intent of the veterans' houses, which were built to be adaptable to the changing needs of owners and occupants and respond to the time's demand for housing. The new official plan directs some growth to this area, and it felt authentic to the area's history and character to actually work towards conservation and intensification together. Finally, a character area does not necessitate the same focus on materials that a heritage conservation district might. These houses have been altered over time and were meant to be. So we were not concerned so much with things like owners changing windows, for example. We brought these recommendations forward to council in 2021 or in 2022, and along with a recommendation to monitor their implementation over 3 years and report back. So as of May 2022, guidelines for the area are in place, and we are monitoring and keeping note of all development occurring in the area. So after all that explanation, you're probably wondering a bit about how they actually work in practice. Generally, the guidelines address the physical characteristics of the neighborhood and the houses. They give recommendations on things like where additions should be located on your property or how to integrate new builds into the area. So typically, heritage planners are notified of planning or building code applications in the area. And if we feel that those guidelines could be better addressed in whatever proposal, we'll look to connect with the applicant or the assigned development review planner and have a discussion and work to actually implement some of those guidelines within the proposal. So this, instead of requiring a permit or something like that, this is where we actually work to influence the design and ultimate alterations through the existing development process. So this can range from things like minor variances and building permits all the way up to applications like zoning bylaw amendments and site plan control. Of course, we also encourage property owners to look to the guidelines themselves and make an effort to integrate those within their projects. So now I'll just give some examples of what these guidelines look at. So on the left, you can see an aerial view, or on the right, you can see an aerial view of Harold Place. And on the left is an image from a fire insurance plan, just to really highlight the buildings. And this kind of shows the setbacks that are quite common throughout the area. So you can see that they're sort of fanned out rather than necessarily being the same across the street. One of the things that's written in the guidelines is an encouragement to retain this sort of unique character and these existing setbacks, or approximating them with new builds where those original setbacks aren't maintained. So here's another image. This kind of shows the typical orientation of buildings and also front entrances towards the street, and also around those grass medians. So again, the guidelines encourage that these features be maintained and integrated into new projects. And finally, this image highlights some of the consistency throughout the area in terms of built form, which is encouraged by the guidelines. So this red dotted line kind of shows the similar ground floor height for buildings across the street, regardless of height. So we have a bit of a variation in terms of size here. And then on the far left in the orange circle, we also have an addition, which is generally compatible through the use of a similar roof form as other houses in the area. So these are all things that are encouraged, both the maintenance of similar compatible ground floor heights, and then also several recommendations about how to make alterations and new additions compatible with the broader character of the area. So now I'll close with a picture of Gowling Public School and touch really briefly on sort of what we've learned at the city through this process. So generally, we have seen some development proposals starting to respond to the new official plan, but overall development activity is stable in the area thus far through our monitoring period. And where there's been opportunities, applicants and property owners have generally been quite open to working with these guidelines and using them to help inform their design and overall alterations to their property. So we've seen a decent amount of uptake, and we've also had a lot of interest just from residents and neighbors, and also from planners and other professionals in other areas about how this character area has worked and the work that we've done. So that's sort of a very brief overview of what the character area is and how it's worked. And we just want to say thank you so much for having us out tonight, and thank you for listening. If you are interested in learning more about the city's approval process and what went down to actually get the character area in place, there are a number of resources available on ottawa.ca. And if you want, please reach out at heritage@ottawa.ca, and Avery or myself would be happy to direct you to those. So that concludes our presentation tonight. Thank you so much. And I think we're going to hand it over for the question and answer period now.
Thank you so much, Greg and Avery, for a fascinating presentation. You grow up in a city and you drive past or walk past or cycle past these places and you think you know them, but apparently not. So this was really, really illuminating. And believe me, you've piqued a lot of interest. I've been taking questions since the very first slide popped up. And to our attendees, I'm simply curating the questions for repetitiveness, or if in fact, as some of you pointed out, you were anticipating what the speakers were going to say. So I'll be doing a little massaging of what came in. So first of all, I'd like to pose a real tough one, because we're looking at Bill 23. How do you intensify in a neighborhood like this? Or can you, or do you want to, or you just, can it be sort of, can you skirt around it, or are you just still wrestling with this one?
I can start off with that one. I think this is one of the sort of really critical questions of heritage planning in the province of Ontario, sort of what is the relationship between conservation and intensification. And it's always something that we're working through, but I think first and foremost, it's the position of the city, and I would say most heritage planners in the province, that intensification and conservation are inherently compatible. They can work together, and they can, I think, mutually benefit each other. And sort of as we mentioned throughout the presentation, the overall intent of this area really was to grow and change with its owners and with its occupants. And it also was built in response to a housing crisis that's very similar to what we're facing today in a lot of ways. So I think it wouldn't be necessarily true to the area to work to actively prevent intensification. And I think that that's one of the overall intents of the guidelines is to find a way to maintain the distinct features that make this area unique, but to also continue to allow for intensification to happen and to encourage it to happen in ways that are compatible.
And there are two questions that are related. One is, to what extent has there been adherence to the guidelines or buy-in to the guidelines, even to the point of resistance to demolition or willingness to demolish? How are individual homeowners pushing against the limitations or embracing the limitations, shall we say?
I don't know if we have a large enough sample size to answer that conclusively at the moment. To be quite honest, we haven't seen a large amount of development activity since this was brought into place. And in the instances where we have engaged with property owners, though, we have had a lot of buy-in, and I think a lot of interest as well. I think it seems that a lot of owners who purchase in this area are interested in its history. It's very apparent, I think, when you walk around the area, that there is something unique to it, and that people are generally interested in maintaining that in some form. So I think it's still early days with a lot of that. But we have had some success with engaging with property owners and getting some additional thought put into place around how these guidelines actually work with new development.
In a way, they're kind of related to the tiny house movement of today. You know, embracing.
I think you could argue that for sure. Yeah, they are quite. I think Avery, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but most properties here are under 900 square feet if left original or around that. So they are quite small. They're also quite large lots. So there's a lot of room for different potentials.
I have a couple of related history questions. One was if you know the name of the actual designer of the subdivision, and if you could tell us a bit more about how that transition to private ownership was managed. Were the mortgages issued by the CMHC, or were purchasers obliged to go to the private financial sector for mortgages?
I'll jump back to the designer question first, because that's a really I think exciting and interesting question. I don't know with certainty who the specific subdivision designer for the Ottawa location was, but there is a book by Bart Denny that alludes to some of the staff as they were taken over by some CMHC and who worked at CMHC. And the two main names that came up that I've seen anyhow are Sam Gitterman. I believe I've got that right. Yeah, Sam Gitterman. And then the other name that I've seen come up is George Regglesworth. And so that's kind of an easy one to remember. A lot of the curves were often described as wriggles. And so Regglesworth, there's a note in the book about them being called Wriggles. And so these were Ottawa folks, I believe, who were involved in subdivision design here. But if anyone listening knows the answer to that, perhaps you could email us at heritage@ottawa.ca and we could add that to our files. In terms of the second question, so I think I'll just back up a little bit. So when the government of Canada was trying to respond to the housing crisis that was happening in the 30s and 40s, there were a lot of different avenues they took. And then when the veterans began to return during the war and then after the war, there was allowances through the Veterans Land Act, I believe, that would allow for those vets to apply for support for mortgages and for land. And so certain veterans chose to actually get that support to buy a lot and build a house themselves. We saw veterans with support from Veterans Land Act start co-ops and build themselves. The Wartime Housing Limited was quite different. It was not under Veterans Land Act. It was under a different part of the government and under different authority. And so I don't know how their mortgage system worked. We didn't really see much detail on that. But my understanding was that we really didn't see too much overlap. I think there was an interest in offloading all of the rental homes at once. So I'm not sure, perhaps, again, if there's residents or kids who grew up in the area, maybe they recall, but from what I've read, it seemed very much like they wanted to offload those homes quickly and get them into private hands.
Mm-hmm. Now, as we know, these were built all across the country. What is particularly striking about this particular, the Carlington veterans housing, is that it's so intact. So in your research, did you look at a comparative base for the region, the province, across the country to determine sort of relative state of intactness of this particular veterans housing area? Or just look at the citywide?
So different staff, we visited different communities as you know, we were outside of work or we've had history going, you know, going to Kitchener or going to other places where the homes are, I think, just throughout our lives. And so often we would, because it was the lockdowns and with the pandemic, we would do a drop-in on Google Street View as well and just check in and have a look around. And so there were a few different approaches we took. I know the Smith Falls houses, I visited those a few times. I have a friend in Smith Falls. And so I think we didn't do a huge analysis of that, but certainly I think the ones that I've seen, and perhaps Greg, this is consistent with ones you've seen as well, I think generally the areas consistently in different municipalities seem to be intact.
Have you
what one you're thinking of, but I'm sure there's a range across Canada and we didn't really get into that level of detail. Yeah.
Have you been approached by other veterans communities within the Ottawa area about doing something similar for their communities?
Not yet. We did get a few questions, particularly about Carlton Heights, I believe, during our study work. I think that's the only one that came up. So that's actually not far away at all. It's just a little bit south of this part of Ottawa. It's just south of Baseline, I think.
Yeah, and just a little bit later, like that. I think that's early 50s.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the grassy medians, are they officially City of Ottawa parkland? How are they managed?
They'd be within the right of way of the City of Ottawa, so the road right of way. So I believe, and I might need to confirm this answer to follow back up with you, but I believe it would just be managed sort of alongside general road maintenance, and then kind of grass cutting operations of the city in general.
So what happens after the 3 years of monitoring? So you go back, and when it's been in place for 3 years, you do an assessment of how successful it's being, and then what happens?
So it's our intent to bring a report back to Built Heritage Committee and Council after the 3 years is over, to kind of report on the results of our monitoring, and if necessary, to recommend changes to the program. So it's still fairly early in our monitoring. I think too early to say sort of whether or not any sort of changes would be recommended. And I think the context of planning and heritage planning in general has shifted and may continue to shift. We really don't know. So I think that was sort of the intent of that monitoring period, is that we knew that there were changes coming via the official plan, just in terms of development in the city generally. And then now with the further shifts to the province as a whole, we think it's just kind of prudent to keep an eye on everything, to engage with stakeholders again, probably at about the halfway point of that monitoring period, and then also later, and then to just to reassess and make sure that our decision really is the best for the ongoing conservation and use of this area.
I was struck in your sources that you referred to local publications. There's a local Facebook page devoted to the neighborhood. So it seems like social history is a big factor in the heritage value of this. And do you see that this adherence to the social values of the community is strong? Is it ongoing? Is it changing with new residents arriving and older ones leaving? What's your sense of continuity there?
Avery, I'll let you jump in on this maybe after. I have one sort of thought on that. I guess just one thing that wasn't actually mentioned in the presentation is that another recommendation that was implemented through this approval process is for actual physical commemoration in the area. So that's something that's still sort of in the development and implementation stages. The city will be working with residents who've expressed some interest to actually implement some commemoration in the area as well, specific to the veterans housing history. So that's one thing that this project also will bring forth. But Avery, I think, maybe has a bit more experience with some of these groups directly, but I think it's fair to say that the social history of the area is important and also being actively engaged with.
Yeah, I think that Greg's absolutely right. I do think we're seeing a shift. I think initially, from what we heard from former residents and also what we read in the Carlington Summit and in some articles we found about how things were in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, there was a very cohesive group. All of these families were connected through that veteran family member who served in the Second World War. And so there was a sense of belonging in that way that we read about and that we heard about. And as the home sold and as kids moved away and parents passed on and those things have evolved, I do think that has shifted. And so that's one reason why it was really helpful to hear about some of the other connections that have formed. So even though kids that grew up there now live in different cities or live in other parts of Ottawa, they can still connect online, or there's still an opportunity for them to stay in touch. But I do think as the years go on, that's going to be lost. And I think that's why council and our team were interested in getting involved in a study now before things shift too much more. And as the OP was mentioned and the intensification, we're expecting to see it across Ottawa, that will continue to have impact on the area. So I think the timing was okay for this, and we're hoping that now that we've gathered those details, we can use that to inform those decisions going forward.
One other question is about a nearby neighborhood, Carlton Heights, which was early 50s. Was that also built specifically as veterans housing, or was that private sector?
That's a trick question. That's okay. So so it was not built by Wartime Housing Limited, the corporation. No. So my understanding of Carlton Heights is that it was built actually by the veterans themselves through funding through the Veterans Land Act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my impression of that type of house in my neighborhood, which is Champlain Park. I live in one of those houses. It looks like a wartime post-war housing, but it was built by a private developer, by a veteran. So this is a community of longtime residents and now young families moving in. And this is another social history question or a social cohesion question. Do you get a sense that there's a fair amount of social cohesion among the different generations because of the setting, because of the sense of community that these houses and their setting create?
I'm not really sure we could speak to that. At least I don't know.
You probably have to live there to.
I think so. I think the best people to ask that to would certainly be the residents and some of the neighborhood experts. There's many who live in the area, who grew up in the area, who are historians and still have connections there. And also the Carlington Community Association, where they're going out and meeting neighbors. I don't know we can answer that, but I think that'll be interesting to hear a response to.
Well, I'm hoping the questions are so enthusiastic, and I sort of hate to wind them up, but I'll ask people if they have more questions, if they could send them into Heritage Ottawa, and we'll pass them on to Greg and Avery. And you can also reach Greg and Avery directly through heritage@ottawa.ca. So I was just blown away by this presentation. It touched on so many aspects of urbanism, the war, housing design, evolutions in building construction, and social cohesion that was really very engaging. And it's a case of heritage planning that goes beyond bricks and mortar. In fact, there wasn't a brick in sight, right? So I'd like to wind up the question period here, and thank you so much on behalf of everyone. But before I let you go, I just want to let everybody know that our next presentation will be the annual Bob and Marianne Phillips Memorial Lecture, online again on February 22nd. Architect Heather MacArthur, former Heritage Ottawa board member, will take us through the rehabilitation of the West Memorial Building. There's all this work going on Wellington Street, and we're all wondering what's going on. So she will bring us through the doors of one of the keystone buildings on that street. Again, online registration will be required, but it's available on the Heritage Ottawa website. And finally, as Catherine mentioned at the beginning, our lectures are provided free of charge. We encourage you to join Heritage Ottawa if you're not yet a member, and to donate to the organization to help us continue our efforts to share heritage stories. And information is available on our website. And with that, I would like to thank Greg and Avery once again, and thank everyone for joining us tonight.